Good morning, everyone. In the spirit of sharing our geographies, I'm actually sitting in Dallas, Texas at the moment, which I think really puts a point to the fact that entrepreneurship has such tremendous support from all of us and so many people that are just not Rhode Island based. There's such a vested interest and commitment to really seeing the startups that are known to us and the ones that we know we're going to inspire, particularly with Danny's methodology today. Entrepreneurship is so critical in so many different ways to society, to our economies. So really, really excited to be here kicking this off. If you leave with no other message, it's the fact that you can do this if you would like to, as Danny pointedly says in his book, and we'll get into that in just a moment. It's not a spirit that you need to be prepossessed with, it's drive and determination and ikigai. So without further ado, Danny, I think we had talked a lot about the 5 tenets of your book. I want you to go ahead and introduce yourself, and then we'll take it from there. And again, questions are most welcome.
Well, thank you, Hope, and thank you everybody who put this wonderful week together. It feels like I'm the only one in Providence today, or in Rhode Island. Happy to be here on the East Side. I'm doing a lot of speaking all over the world, so I can empathize with all the travel that you're doing. And it's nice to be on home turf. I've been involved with the Rhode Island entrepreneurship community. It feels like before there really was a Rhode Island entrepreneurship community, when I was a student at Brown, and I fell into an opportunity to be part of a software startup that we built up and we sold to Apple. This was in the late 80s. And sometimes I have to clarify to my students and maybe others that there were actually computers in the late 80s. And I have to clarify to some that there was entrepreneurship in Rhode Island. And I can say that there was nothing like Rhode Island Startup Week, nothing like Rihub, nothing like Mass Challenge, nothing like the Nelson Center for Entrepreneurship back then. And so what an amazing community we all are part of if we're entrepreneurs or aspiring entrepreneurs. So it's a pleasure to be here today with all of you.
And the agenda does look stacked. So Danny, I have the great fortune at the moment of working with a large cohort of 251 early stage startups across the globe. 74% of that group are actually first-time founders. So I know this is sort of your bailiwick. So can you just talk to us about the methodology or the process that you've outlined in the book?
Sure. I've been teaching entrepreneurship at Brown for about 17 years. In fact, I see some of my former students here with us today, which is an honor. And when I was asked by Barrett Hazeltine, a beloved professor, probably of all the Brown students and alumni represented here this morning, to teach it at Brown, I had to think, well, what does it mean to teach entrepreneurship at all, let alone to teach it in the context where there's no business school defining what entrepreneurship is or guiding us to, in a narrow way, how to teach it. And so I thought, well, I've heard of this phrase, many of you I'm sure have as well, entrepreneurial spirit. And I thought, well, surely I can't be asked to teach a spirit. I don't even really understand what entrepreneurship spirit is. And then I thought, well, I'm in the engineering school. That's where my faculty appointment happens to be. And how silly it would be, what if we said, when we wanted to guide somebody to learn how to build a bridge, we said, just go out and have the bridge building spirit. And if the bridge collapses and the cars and the trucks fall to earth, then just go out there and have more spirit. And I thought, no, of course not. That would be ridiculous. We would never be trusted to teach anything else. In bridge building, you can distill some fundamental principles, a structured process, a beginning, a middle, and an end, that all bridges have in common, even though there's lots of room for variation in every bridge, aesthetically, operationally, functionally. And I thought, well, probably similarly in entrepreneurship, there must be some key principles that we could distill that every entrepreneurial venture has in common, a beginning, a middle, and an end, even though there's lots of variation for any kind of venture to distinguish itself from any other. And that's the basis of the see, solve, scale structured process for solving problems that I developed back then, that I've been teaching at Brown and other places around the world, and that many of my students put me up to encoding in a book, in this book. And the definition that I used back then and is the basis of this 3-step process is a structured process for solving problems without regard to the resources currently controlled. Now, there's a lot embedded in there, much more than we can cover in 20 minutes. It's what we cover over the course of a full semester, but that's the basis of the book. What's the process? First of all, that there is a process that you can learn, that you can master and apply. What are those 3 steps? See, solve, scale. And how do they relate to this definition of a structured process for solving problems without regard to the resources currently controlled?
Amazing. I'm not sure we have a fully convinced audience here, and I'm looking specifically at Banu, your class there of 40. I'm certain there are some reluctant entrepreneurs in our midst. So Danny, what do you say to those reluctant entrepreneurs? Or I know you have quite a compelling case study.
Well, the subtitle of this book, I think, is even more important. And Banu actually helped me to devise this subtitle. It's How Anyone Can Turn an Unsolved Problem into a Breakthrough Success. And it underscores anyone, because let's face it, and I learned these specific statistics from Banu, there's been many people in our societies in the United States and around the world who've been neglected, ignored, and discriminated against. When only 2.3% of venture-backed startup founders are women, only 1.5% are Latinx founders, only 1% are Black founders, it's clear that many segments of our society have been neglected, ignored, and discriminated against. And many may feel that they are reluctant about, am I really qualified to be an entrepreneur? So a lot of my teaching, a lot of the work at the Nelson Center, a lot of the message of the book is about inclusion and to engage people who have been left behind by mainstream entrepreneurship. And if it's okay, can we share a brief video that will give you some insight into one of those students who I think I'm particularly proud of and who I think is good evidence that this is a methodology that anybody can learn, and you'll hear from Emma Butler about how she's been doing that. The book, as you know, is See, Solve, Scale: How Anyone Can Turn an Unsolved Problem into a Breakthrough Success, underscore anyone. And you always come to mind. In fact, I describe you in the book as a reluctant entrepreneur. Can you rewind and just share with us the short story about your first exposure to entrepreneurship in my course?
Absolutely. I had no idea that I was ever going to be an entrepreneur. I didn't know what entrepreneurship was. I didn't know anything about what the methodology of becoming an entrepreneur was. As a visual arts and French student at Brown, I really didn't think I was prepared to do the financial modeling, to think critically about entrepreneurship, to do the Harvard Business School case studies. I didn't think I had anything in me, let alone after the course to build a company. But as I walked in, quite literally shaking because I was so nervous that I was going to be called on, or that it was going to be too hard on the first day and I was going to have to drop out right there and then, and be so embarrassing. I sat there and you briefly explained a little bit about this See, Solve, Scale methodology. And I thought, I can understand that. That's something that I can digest. And that's a great first step. See, I can do that. I can find a problem. I know a problem and it's an unmet need. Okay, I got that. And so being able to break it down into these digestible steps was really great for somebody like me that was really starting at ground zero. The problem with Intimately, it was a personal one. About 10 years ago, my mom became disabled and it became extremely difficult for her to find clothing that she could get on independently that was both functional and fashionable. And so the problem that we're solving is making sure that the 600 million women worldwide that have some sort of disability that affects the way they dress have options in clothing that is both functional and fashionable and can bring them confidence. And intimately, we're in the scale stage. We just closed our seed round of $1 million led by the British Fashion Council as their very first investment. I'm currently based in Paris. Our team of about 5 full-time women who are both disabled and non-disabled are living in the States. We've just released our first line that was launched in Vogue Business, Business of Fashion. We've been in Forbes, Glamour, Cosmopolitan, and we're ready to take this scale and go all the way with it.
Great story. I love that.
One nice addition quickly is that Emma is from Rhode Island originally. She grew up in Portsmouth. Her twin sister Zoe also went to Brown. Both were my students at Brown. And so I don't always add that Emma's from Rhode Island when I'm in Bahrain or Jordan or China talking about Emma, but it's nice that she's from Rhode Island, given that this is Rhode Island Startup Week.
Great. So I think if you have not heard loud and clear, all of our prospective entrepreneurs out there, this book is a great on-ramp for anybody to consider the entrepreneurship journey and pathway. I really want to spend a few minutes in our last time here on the concept of Ikigai, because I think that that is really at the heart and soul of so much of the messaging here. So Danny, would you please define for the group here Ikigai and then how it pertains to the methodology?
Sure, I'd be happy to. You know, there's a lot of details in this book about how you do the entrepreneurial process, how you find an unmet need. That's the C stage, doing bottom-up research, and I guide you through the specific details of how to do that. I guide you through the second stage of the solve, which is iterative on a small scale, where you're using all these concepts and structures of like nominal group technique and systematic inventive thinking. And it's a fun process. It's the creative, innovative stage. And the scale stage is important too, where you're, as Gina, I think, said, have ambition to grow $100 million venture, not just a small business. And all that's important. But at its core, and I think you can see this just emanating from Emma, none of that matters if you don't have the 4 elements of Ikigai. Ikigai is a Japanese concept that means living a life of meaning and of purpose. I actually have to give a shout out to my youngest daughter, Marin, who brought that Japanese concept to my attention a couple of years ago when she was doing some leadership training in her camp. And she said, Dad, there's this concept called Ikigai, and I think it embodies a lot of what you've been teaching and trying to inspire your students about. The 4 pillars of Ikigai, of living a meaningful life, are 1, do something that you're really good at, and we might call that drive. Do something that you really love to do. We might call that passion. Do something that will give meaning to the world and have meaningful impact, and we might call that purpose. And then do something that's going to have a financial reward that'll pay you fairly for the value that you're adding. And so you can do the C-solve scale method academically, methodically, but if you don't do it in a way that wraps Ikigai around it, in my experience as an entrepreneur and as a venture capitalist, and certainly as a teacher and mentor and a coach, I don't think you're going to be successful. And so Ikigai, I do think, is the bedrock that undergirds the C-solve scale method, so much so that we have a poster, an embroidery on the wall of the Nelson Center that shouts that loud and clear. And I emphasize that from the very first day of my teaching in my classes at Brown. And I think it's resonant among lots of students at Brown. I hope it is among lots of the entrepreneurs who are here today. The kind of startups represented on that long agenda, the kind of focus I can see does, I think, resonate to those kinds of concepts. So I'm glad you asked, because sometimes I'm on all these podcasts, I'm on all these radio shows, and they're very interested in all the technical details of C-solve scale. And I always make sure to say, None of that matters if you're not doing something that you're good at, that you love, that is adding meaning to the world, and that is going to pay you fairly for the value you're adding.
So Danny, we've just given our audience a heavy lift here. You've outlined a process, and you've also shown us an instance where the entrepreneur is solving for something that's very near and dear in the spirit of her mother. But there's also, not to diminish the social impact, but the other component of all of this is you can be passionate without needing to save the world or to do something that is so hugely critical and meaningful. And I'm thinking of particularly the Casper case study that you have in there. So I think just to provide a little levity to the room here so that people get into that more experimental frame of mind, excuse me. Can you speak to how you might merge the concept of Ikigai to the C solve scale methodology? So we're driven, but we've got a process, and we're not necessarily trying to change climate or humanity.
Well, first of all, the way I define entrepreneurship, as I say, is that you're solving a problem, a structured process for solving a problem. Now, problems can be very consequential, really serious, like climate change, like healthcare, like diversity issues. But we also have to be entertained. We have to sleep well. We have to eat well. And so I do think it's possible to frame lots of things, even if they don't seem as consequential, maybe as adaptive clothing for women with different shaped bodies. I actually think if you ask the Casper founders, who are my students, Luke Sherwin and Neil Parikh, they would tell you that they are changing the world in a pretty consequential way. You may not know, although they were a public company for a while, for a long time, and they still are, Casper is a B Corp. And they take what they are doing very seriously, that sleep, let's face it, we spend a lot of time sleeping, or at least trying to sleep. And if we don't do that effectively, we're not going to be effective entrepreneurs or even effective people generally. Casper's a really good example of a concept I teach in class and around the world in workshops and in the book, called the benefits of scarce resources, where the Casper founders knew nothing about the mattress industry. I like to say the only thing they knew is that you sleep on a mattress. And yet they found and validated a really significant unmet need, that the way you buy a mattress was completely screwed up. They knew nothing about it. And the fact that they knew nothing about the way you're supposed to build a mattress company worked in their favor. They weren't biased. They weren't protecting their existing methodologies. They didn't have a lot to lose. And so they were willing to take risks. At the time I published this book about 4 months ago, Casper was doing $400 million in revenue. They had been a public company. They had raised well over $200 million in capital privately, and then more as a public company. They completely revolutionized the way that you build a mattress company, and for consumers, completely imagined the way that you would buy a mattress, have it delivered, have a 100-night free trial, and a guarantee to return it, have it branded in a way that would appeal to younger people, and have it delivered in a way that you would buy anything, just like you would buy anything online today. And so I do think it was their Ikigai. I think they discovered a problem that they had drive to solve, that they realized they could do in a way that was something they would love to do. I do think that they believe that it was a way to add value to the world. Again, people spend a lot of time sleeping or trying to sleep, and they were paid well for it. And so I think at its core, at least to qualify as entrepreneurship, I think you have to be solving a problem. It doesn't have to be a problem that's as heady as any of these necessarily. Imperfect Foods is another good example. Ben Chesler was one of my students. They realized that 40% of all produce is being thrown out because it doesn't look appropriate, even though it's perfectly edible and nutritious. They figured out a new model to source that produce directly from farmers. repackage it, sell it directly to consumers for 30% less than retail. And they talk about scale, the third step of the process. They scaled to the point where they were doing over $200 million in revenue. They had raised over $250 million in venture capital, 1,500 employees in well-paying jobs in 43 states. And the thing that Ben will tell you he's most proud of is that they, at the time I published this book a few months ago, had already saved 100 million pounds of food that otherwise would have gone to waste. And so, yeah, there's a range of seriousness in this kind of entrepreneurship. We have to be entertained too. We have to laugh. All sorts of industries that you can focus this methodology on. But again, at its core is that you've found and validated an unmet need, and it's a problem that you're really excited to solve.
Great. So entrepreneurship is indeed expansive, as you have articulated many times here. So Danny, what is, as we sort of wrap things up here, well, first of all, I think for those of us who are locally minded, as you all should be sitting here at Rhode Island Startup Week, presumably the C-Solve Scale book can be purchased in our local bookstores. Danny, is that correct?
You can. I'll plug too, Wayland Square Books, and also the Brown Bookstore, and of course at all the obvious places online. Again, I want to thank my students, again, some of whom are here today, because I never thought about writing a book. First of all, I had never thought about teaching before Barrett Hazeltine gave me that consequential tap on the shoulder. It was my students who told me, hey, you're not doing this third step of the process. You're not scaling. And I said, ooh, how interesting when the students become the teacher. And I said, well, what should I do? And they said, you should write a book. This was a little over 4 years ago. And, you know, before you do anything, you're naive enough to think you might do it. And I just dove in and I started writing, and it attracted an agent and then publishers. And it's going to be published in China, Taiwan, Japan, Korea. It's already been published in the UK and circulated around a lot of places around the world that buy product from the UK. And it's going to be published in Arabic coming up. So this is not an experience I anticipated. And I'm enormously honored by all of you today for your interest, for all the people who have hosted me on podcasts and radio. This approach to entrepreneurship seems to have struck a chord, that this is a methodology that anyone can learn, master, and apply to solve a problem. And there's other messages in here that I think are also important. Again, a shout out to Banu Askazeng Pan, my colleague from Brown, not only for helping me define some of the problem, but also clarify what some of the diversity and inclusion benefits are of the methodology that I teach. And we don't have time to get into it in too much detail, but that's a really important, strong message as well of the book, not only in terms of its societal impact, and we need that kind of impact, but also in terms of what's the sweet spot for forming a successful venture team. And there's a lot of guidance here, because entrepreneurship in general is a team sport, not a solo sport. And the most successful teams are the ones that engage people from their weak ties, not their strong ones, to form a diverse team, and then go beyond just forming the diverse team, but engage that diverse team to be their authentic selves and bring their whole selves to the table and to the team as they, in the C stage, find and validate an unmet need, in the solve stage, get creative and innovative to iteratively solve the problem on a small scale, and then very much to think about how do you have impact in a way that's going to be a big solution over the long term. And in order to do that, the best way is to have a diverse team that is engaged inclusively. And that's another message of the book that I'm really proud of.
Great. So I'm going to debate the book. It is, of course, in its form factor, a book, but I actually think it's uniquely a blueprint for entrepreneurship. That is, we are very advantaged here in Rhode Island to have you in our backyard. And also just, again, look at all of the resources that you have. For those of you that are looking at the participant chain here in this Zoom, so many familiar faces to me. That's because I happen to spend a lot of time creating seed and sod in Rhode Island, trying to drive entrepreneurs to come out of the woodwork. But we are genuinely blessed to have so many amazing resources at our fingertips. And it was said earlier, but Rihub is a great starting point to directionally find the support, whether you're just trying to determine, have I seen an idea? Can you tell me whether or not this is in fact an unmet need? Or I'm not sure about the what a financial model might look like, or a cap table when you get to that point. So again, Rhode Island has an embarrassment of riches, so take advantage of them. And we are, again, very, very, very privileged to have the Nelson Center and Danny in our midst. So,
well, thank you. It's very nice of you to say that. I will tell you, you're right to debate whether it's a book. It's also an audio book, which I also had no experience doing. And it was a bit of a challenge, although an interesting one. Again, benefits of scarce resources. During COVID, I wasn't able to go into the publisher's studio to record it. First of all, they asked me to record it. And I thought, am I really the one to record an audiobook? I've never done that. And they said, yes, it's your teaching, it's your methodology. Of course, it should be your voice. And I said, okay, well, if you can't get Morgan Freeman, I'll do it. And they had to ship me a sort of a makeshift studio that I could set up in my basement here on the East Side. And over the course of a week, 7 days, about 6 or 7 hours a day, I recorded the audio version. And I'm finding, it's interesting, I'm finding a lot of people gravitating to that medium instead of, or even in addition, I spoke to somebody the other day who said he has both. He's listening and he's reading. So that's been an interesting process. You're right in terms of resources. Like I said before, when I was part of that startup back in the late 80s, there was none of this. There was not Ted Howell talking about the difference between a safe and a convertible note. There was nothing like Rihub. There was nothing like Mass Challenge. There was nothing like the Nelson Center. This is really an amazing golden age of entrepreneurship that's just starting here in Rhode Island and building its momentum going forward. And so if I'm part of it in any meaningful way, it's my ikigai. It's those 4 elements apply to my role here. So I'm very honored to be part of it in any way that is helpful to people. I will say, and I see a couple of people have put in the chat, if you'd like, a good way to get a hold of me is through my website, which I think Annette put there. There's more information about the book. There's 2 other little shorts, just like the one you saw from Emma. One is from Ben Chesler of Imperfect Foods. One is from Gwen Mugodi of a Zimbabwe startup that came out of the Nelson Center, addressing childhood literacy in African countries. And so a lot of more details about the book and additional tools that you can gather there. And of course, information about me. And it's a good way to get in touch with me. And I'll also say that you're right, it's not just a book. There's now a small and growing LinkedIn network of people who have read the book or at least taken interest in it. And what's interesting is they're from all over the world and they're meeting each other and collaborating. And so if you search for See, Solve, Scale on LinkedIn, you'll find that network group.
Danny, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you, Hope.